Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. Today I'd like to visit with you and talk a bit about the Syria ceasefire that just has been put into effect a couple days ago. And they're going to try that again, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, why don't we give our listeners a little update on our weekend, with our conference. I want to thank those viewers of this program that showed up there. So I was very pleased that those individuals did come. But you did a fantastic job. All I heard were good reports about it, and they're just asking when and are we going to have another conference? And since you did such a good job, we're going to have a hard time not doing another one of these days. But why don't you give us a little update on how you viewed the conference?
Well, I think I have to say I was so thrilled to meet so many people. The room was completely full. We had the entire ballroom. It was literally standing room only. We had to put some chairs in the back for people that came late that were, dying to get in. So it was completely full. We had great speakers. C-SPAN was there, and they covered the event for us, which was great. But as you said, one of the things that I felt most touched by, because you said it once in a video, we feel a little isolated out here in our studio. But it was so moving to me and so exciting, and it gave me so much energy to meet so many of the viewers of the Liberty Report. So many people came up and said, I watch it every day. Some of them even said, I watch it live, which is sort of our special coffee club. Yeah. But it was really a thrill to meet these people who watch what we do every day. They came out to see us. And yes, definitely we do plan to not only have another event like that, but to do more of them.
Okay. We were very pleased when C-SPAN said they'd like to come, and they came. They had their 3 cameras. They had a crew of 3, and they stayed for 5 hours. And then they gave us some information, and we haven't sorted all this out yet because they had planned to, at least put it on their website. But I don't know if it's up yet, but we have to keep checking. But it didn't get up real fast. So sometimes they do delay some of these postings, but the audience have to just keep an eye. And if we do hear about it, we'll send something out to say when it was posted, because I know we announced that C-SPAN was there, so people looked, and then they were disappointed when they didn't find it.
Yeah, so hopefully they'll have it up soon. We'll keep talking to them about it.
Okay. Now let's deal a little bit with this new ceasefire. The Russians and the Americans and the various groups of people involved in the fight and the civil war, civil strife in Syria. They had an agreement in February. And it didn't work out too well. Now they're trying to change this a little one with a little more teeth in it, where the fighting was stopped. So on the surface, I look at this and I say, well, we shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be dealing with this. And some people say, well, a true libertarian's not going to have an agreement with the Russians. Besides, there's people picking at it because of some technicalities on why we shouldn't be doing that. But superficially, on what we see under current conditions, and having looked at the past 5 years of things that I think we were, responsible for in many ways, because it was in 2011 that that Obama said Assad has to go. And even though they don't talk so much about that anymore, I'm sure there's many people in the administration, and there's many people who put pressure on the administration. The neocons are still alive and well, and there is no way they're going to back off and say, oh, yeah, in 2011 we thought he has to go, so we've changed our mind. But reality looks like it may have changed some people's mind. At least this, to me, on the surface, sounds like this is an agreement that under these circumstances, I have to say, well, you ought to try to work it out. If people are fighting, even though we believe we could have prevented all this by just staying out of there, but if 2 groups are fighting and killing each other and it's a mess and they're coming up with a ceasefire, as imperfect as is, I would think an adjustment and say an encouragement of this, in some ways, this is a little bit of hope and a little bit of a positive message. And we've been reporting and talking about Syria for a long time because it's still very, very important. But let's hope this comes about and improves. But I'm sure you have looked at this and find out there might be just a few shortcomings. this in this agreement.
Yeah, as you point out, our what we would like to see is the U.S. to completely pull out and to stop supporting armed groups in Syria or anywhere else for that matter. That's not happening with this agreement. What the neocons would like is a full frontal U.S. invasion of Syria to overthrow Assad and put someone else in power. Thankfully, that's not happening right now, at least. So that's why we should be happy about the ceasefire. But the ceasefire in February, it held for a while, but the problem is it ignores the core issue, which is that there is a foreign-backed rebellion in Syria trying to overthrow the government. So until you actually deal with that issue, it's rather superfluous whether they're shooting or not. You know?
I always look at that as being strategic and tactical. This is a tactical adjustment here, but it's not strategic in what is our business there, and how, have we participated in any way in a positive way? And I think that is so important. But they did make some statements here I want to bring up because it expresses the whole issue of why there's so much confusion there, because there's so many different groups, and most of the groups don't like us there, by the way.
Yeah.
But the agreement says that it stops Assad from bombing against the rebels. And the rebels are people that we've been there. So Assad has agreed not to bomb them anymore. But it allows the Syrian government to strike al-Qaeda. So yes, we're going to stop bombing them, but we can do a little bombing over here. And in the U.S. is allowed to strike ISIS. So, you have the al-Qaeda, the Syrians are allowed to attack, and we don't like ISIS, at least on the surface, we don't like ISIS, and so we're allowed to strike them. So that just seems like it's still pretty much of a can of worms. And so many opportunities for the whole thing to fall apart. But at least they're moving in this right direction. And they said that if there's a ceasefire worth anything, they're going to move in some humanitarian aid, to Aleppo and help the starving people. But once again, humanitarian aid, what bothers me is everybody will be sympathetic for the people starving. But I know over many years of watching this, and when you send in food to a place like this, it's whoever gets to distribute the food, it becomes a military weapon. I'll give you food if you fight for our side, this sort of thing.
True. One of the key problems with this ceasefire, in a sense, is that it is a component that's identical from the earlier ceasefire. Okay, the Syrians have to ask permission from the U.S. to bomb rebels in their own country, which is pretty funny if you think about it. Kerry said that over the weekend. But the key issue is that the problem is the so-called moderate rebels are, and even the U.S. government admits this, are intertwined with al-Qaeda in Syria. They work together, they integrate their fighting, they coordinate their fighting, they share weapons. So this is a huge problem. The Syrian government says, okay, we'll stop bombing the moderates, but you got to tell us, first of all, which ones are the moderates that we should stay away from, and you've got to he's telling the U.S., you've got to tell the moderates that you're backing that they have got to pull away from al-Qaeda. And there are conflicting reports now in the U.S. as to whether it will live up to this obligation, whether the U.S. will tell rebels that it backs, the moderates, stop fighting, stop coordinating with al-Qaeda, or you're going to get bombed. They won't do that yet. And I think the real reason is the U.S. is terrified that the whole world will see that the moderate rebel is like a unicorn. It's a mythical creature that doesn't exist. And without the support of al-Qaeda, these moderates will probably be very low in number and will fall flat on their face.
And maybe the whole entanglement might disintegrate if that becomes known. But, there was another headline on this that I thought was interesting because there are some people who are strongly objecting to this, and they happen to be, sort of from the neocons. What are we doing even talking to the Russians? You can't trust the Russians. So, and they're suggesting there are legal and liability questions. And in a technical sense, there are some legal things involved. One of the things they cite is that, after the problems occurring in Ukraine and Crimea, the Congress, with their infinite wisdom, went and said, that we prohibit our government from ever, working with the Russians in a military sense, which isn't a bad idea, but why not everybody? We shouldn't be doing those kind of things. But anyway, it was written into law, so they're saying that, this is a violation of this, and therefore we shouldn't do it, so they're objecting. And this just bugs me a little bit, because here these guys are technically wanting to obey the law, but preemptive war and bombing and killing and civilians and torture and all these things means nothing. But on this instance, we have to live up to what the Congress wants us to do.
And imagine Congress writing a law that says we can't negotiate with another country, we can't coordinate with another country, we can't even protect American pilots from potentially getting killed or putting in a bad situation, because the Congress says don't even talk to them, don't you dare.
See, the other thing that they're dealing with in this negotiation and talking, and the people who don't like this agreement, is that you can't trust the Russians. Let's face it, and it's terrible that they're dealing with it. That's our territory. It's a little bit away from home, but it's still part of our empire, and we have to take care of this problem because they're claiming that because of this situation, and it is a mess, there's a lot of a lot of bombs being dropped, and a lot of people shooting weapons, but the bombs are being dropped by 2 governments, maybe 3, for all we know, because we haven't even mentioned the Kurds. We probably won't talk much about the Kurds, but they're always involved in this too. But the anti-people against this and saying, well, this is so dangerous, it's against the law, is that the Russians, because they're careless and their bombs aren't nearly as accurate as the American bombs, that civilians might get killed. And does that mean that we, the United States, have a moral responsibility for the civilians that the Russians might kill? I think that we should have a moral responsibility for citizens and civilians being killed, of which we have been involved in many-fold over many years. And some people even claim that the amount of death and destruction that we have caused, some people think that war crimes have been committed. So this to me is rather ironic. And anybody who listens to this and believe they're actually serious when you think of all the infractions that they get involved with, and I'm talking about those individuals who don't want anything, any negotiation or any talk with the Russians, that they're anxious to just have conflict. I mean, just listen to so much of what we hear politically. You got to in Congress, you got to be tough against the Russians, or you're anti-American, you're unpatriotic.
It's amazing. But you know what else is amazing? The same neocons who for years and years said, we've got to bomb Iraq, we've got to bomb Afghanistan, we've got to go everywhere to fight Al-Qaeda, we need more war to fight Al-Qaeda. They're the same ones saying now that the Russians and the Americans shouldn't be bombing Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Right.
They turn on a dime. But the thing about Aleppo, and it's important, we talked about it before the show, there was a big brouhaha, one of the candidates didn't know what was going on there apparently, what have you. But what's happened is the city is divided, and part of it is controlled by Al-Qaeda. There's no ISIS in there. But part of it's controlled by Al-Qaeda, and part of it is controlled by the Syrian government. Well, the part that Al-Qaeda controls is virtually empty. They've all moved over to the part where the government controls. It's virtually empty. But this ceasefire is restricting the ability of the Syrian government to bomb this part occupied by Al-Qaeda. And you can say that is good, but imagine, we like to do this a lot, imagine if the shoe were on the other foot and half of Los Angeles was occupied by Al-Qaeda. They were determined to overthrow our country. Now, do you think that Obama would agree to a ceasefire for that part of Los Angeles that was occupied by Al-Qaeda?
And that's what we're asking them to do. Right? You mentioned that one the key element here is that if there was no foreign element in here, there'd be essentially no war. There was civil strife, and there were problems and factions, and there were Syrians that didn't like Assad and that sort of thing, but nothing like what's going on for these past 5 years in the total destruction. But, the other question comes up is, if we weren't there and if the Russians took somewhat different position, they wouldn't be nearly doing what they're doing now if they didn't have our factions to contend with. how do these things work out? And the argument that I've used, if we aren't involved there, whether it was Iraq, especially Iraq is a good example, but Syria, who knows? If we really could just have peace and letting these factions work their problem on, there might be two Syrias. There might be an East and West. Who knows? And who knows? They might even voluntarily have an association. It's this principle of self-determination. I think that it's probably less likely in a place like Syria, but Ukraine actually lends itself to that. An East and West, because of their cultures are different. They could do that if you had self-determination with voluntary associations, to work together. Certainly, Iraq is so torn up. And it's not a single country, that the odds of the path that we're on now, if anybody's goal is to restore the integrity and the geography of Iraq and Syria and Ukraine, that's not likely to happen.
Well, it is this is why we always talk about interventionism. It is the foreign interventionism that creates the fault lines that lead to the destruction of these different societies. We can certainly go back at least to Yugoslavia. There's certainly, after the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War being over, there was a move for people there to maybe return to their individual republics. But the U.S. and Germany and other countries got in there, and they really put people against people and ethnicities against ethnicities and created the conflict. And the same is true in Iraq, where it was the U.S. interventionism. The same in Libya, the U.S. interventionism. It creates these crises as an excuse to justify more interventionism. It just continues to roll on.
When the Soviet system collapsed, it really was an opportunity for peace to break out, but it was also an opportunity for the sole superpower to take advantage of it, because they were in a contest. The United States was in a contest with the Soviets, who had the biggest, who could maintain the biggest domination of others, and whose empire would win out. Because that became the goal. The goal, it seems like it was totally forgotten. Where's the peace dividend? What should be the goal? Shouldn't the goal be to have a country, a true republic that emphasizes true liberty and, the prosperity that comes with sound money and property rights? And see, that wasn't ever even talked about. The thing was talking about who's going to control Yugoslavia, who's going to control Eastern Europe. So immediately, I see what we have done is we have just surrounded the Russians in Iran. I mean, if you look at the weapon systems that we have, moving our missiles right up to the borders of the Russians, and then people say, well, it's all the Russians' fault. Well, like we always say, what would we do if anybody decided to do that to us? Right now we're worrying about the Persian Gulf and confronting any ships from Iran and also in the South China Sea. What would we be doing, and would we be worried if we had those type of foreign vessels, just off the shores in the Gulf of Mexico? I mean, we wouldn't put up with that. But everybody is taught to be super macho. If you're not a tough guy and you really believe it, you're not American, and you're not willing to go to war, you're a chicken. We have some chickens there, and they're called mostly chicken hawks that are always warmongering, but they're the ones who never find themselves with a gun in their hand getting shot at.
Well, the reason we didn't have this peace dividend is very simple. And I just spent a few days in Washington. I drove around the area. It is the military-industrial complex. They cannot stand for peace to break out. Drive around in Washington, you'll see skyscraper after skyscraper. They're all defense contractors. These defense contractors give money to think tanks. Think tanks write papers saying how we need to intervene in country X or country Y, which benefit the defense contractors. And it's a cycle that goes on and on. Imagine how much more money would be in the average working American's pocket, if he didn't have to subsidize the rich people in Washington living off of this phony, all of these lies.
Yes, and let me remind the the audience that when the Soviet system collapsed, we didn't have to fight them. There wasn't a war that went on, and it became a financial issue. And that's the way this will end. But in the meantime, we have to do our very best to understand how the world will work in a more peaceful situation, and why true republics can do a much better job rather than this idea of socialism and cultural Marxism and all the nonsense going on in the world today. So there's reason for us to be hopeful and expect this to be resolved. It's going to be a bumpy road, but let me tell you with my conviction that this is not affordable. We cannot continue to do this. We can't continue to prop up our financial markets the way we do. We can't just run up debt and printing money, and we can't maintain this empire. And I think they're starting to have cracks in that already, both financially and militarily, because we will be unable to do it. So I invite everybody to pay lots of attention to what's going on, especially right now in Syria, since we've been following that closely. And I want to thank all of you for being with us today at the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.